Morning of the estate meeting, my daughter-in-law, Cheryl, arrived 20 minutes early. I watched her from the upstairs window as she stepped out of her Audi, smoothed her blazer, and looked up at the house the way a property assessor does, not the way a woman looks at the home where her husband grew up. She had that expression she always wore when she thought no one was watching, calculating, like she was already measuring the rooms. My wife Joan had been gone for 11 days. 11 days. And Cheryl was already in the driveway with her reading glasses and a folder full of papers she'd printed the night before. I came downstairs slowly. My knee had been giving me trouble since the fall, and the stairs at our house in Kelowna are steep. Joan always said we'd renovate them one day. We never did. There are so many things we never did, and now the list has stopped growing. And somehow that's the part that hurts the most. My son, Kevin, came in behind his wife. He kissed me on the cheek the way men do when they're not sure what to say. He smelled like the same cologne he's worn since he was 19. I used to tease him about it. That morning I couldn't find the words for teasing. "Dad," he said, "how are you holding up?" "I'm managing," I said. "Coffee's on." Cheryl was already in the dining room, setting out her papers on Joan's good table. The one Joan refinished herself the summer of 2004, stripping it down to bare wood and staining it a warm walnut. I stood in the doorway and watched Cheryl arrange her folders with the efficiency of someone who had been planning this moment for a long time. My lawyer, Gerald, was due at 10. My accountant, Phil, at 10:15. In Joan's family, you handled things formally. Paperwork, signatures, witnesses. It was how her father had done it, and how his father had done it before him. I had always respected that. I still did. What I had not expected was Cheryl to speak first. "Before anyone gets here," she said, without looking up, "Kevin and I want to walk through what we think is the fair division." I pulled out a chair and sat down. "That's what the meeting is for, Cheryl." "Right, but we've already done a lot of the groundwork." She slid a document across the table. We had our own solicitor look at the will. Kevin was standing by the window with his coffee, looking out at the backyard. Joan's garden was still out there. The raised beds she built, the lilac bushes she planted the year Kevin was born. He didn't turn around. I looked at the document. It was a summary. Their solicitor's interpretation of Joan's will, with certain assets highlighted in yellow. The house was highlighted, the RRSP, the small investment account we'd built together over 32 years. "Where does it say," I asked carefully, "that any of this goes to you before I'm gone?" Cheryl looked up. She had a way of composing her face into something that resembled patience, without actually containing any. "Joan's will stipulates that Kevin inherits a significant share of the estate. That includes the family home." "After I pass," I said. "The will says after I pass, Cheryl. I've read it rather carefully given that my wife just died." There was a silence. Kevin's coffee cup clinked gently against the window ledge. "The estate planning also needs to account for estate taxes," Cheryl continued, as though I hadn't spoken. "The probate process in BC can take time, and Kevin's share of the business." "Kevin has a share of the business." "Kevin has a share of nothing," I said. "The business is mine." Joan was never a partner on paper. That was intentional. Cheryl smiled. It was the smile she used when she thought she held better cards. "That may be the case, but the matrimonial property legislation..." "Cheryl." I kept my voice even. "My lawyer will be here in 40 minutes. I suggest we wait." She opened her mouth, closed it, looked at Kevin. Kevin, to his credit, or perhaps to his shame, said nothing. "I want to tell you about Joan before I go any further, because none of the rest of it makes sense without her. We met in the fall of 1988 at a curling club in Vernon. She was there with her friend, and I was there because I'd lost a bet with my buddy from work and owed him a night of what he called wholesome recreation. Joan was laughing at something her friend said when I walked in, and I remember thinking that whoever made her laugh like that was a lucky person. I spent the rest of the evening trying to be that person. We were married 14 months later, in January, in a little ceremony at her parents' place because her mother was sick and couldn't travel. Her father shook my hand for a long time before he let go. He had worked his whole life in the lumber industry, built something real with his hands, and I think he wanted to feel whether I was the kind of man who would take care of what was his. I hope I was. We built our business together in the practical sense. I made the decisions, she kept the books, and for the first decade we ran everything out of the spare bedroom. Holloway Property Management. 43 residential and commercial properties in the Okanagan. It wasn't glamorous, but it was ours, and every single thing in it we had either earned or sacrificed for. Kevin was born in 1991. He was a sweet kid. Funny, a little dreamy, the kind of boy who read too much and played too little sport for my taste. But I loved him completely and without condition. I coached his hockey team for 3 years, even though he sat on the bench for most of it. I drove 4 hours round trip to his university graduation. When he told me he was marrying Cheryl, I took them both to dinner at the best restaurant I knew and ordered the good wine. I wanted them to be happy. I genuinely did. The trouble started quietly, the way trouble usually does. Small things first. Cheryl suggesting that Kevin deserved a management role in the business, even though he had no background in property management. Kevin mentioning almost casually that they'd been looking at the unit we owned on Abbott Street, a 3-bedroom rental property, as a possible starter home. And wasn't it time we thought about updating the family's real estate portfolio? Cheryl asking Joan more than once what the plan was for the estate. Joan was polite about it. She was always polite. But she said things to me in the evenings, quiet things, half worries she didn't want to say out loud and make real. I don't think she sees us as people. Love. I think she sees us as an inheritance she hasn't collected yet. I told Joan she was being uncharitable. I was wrong. Joan's diagnosis came in the March of last year. Pancreatic cancer. Stage 3, which the oncologist explained with the careful, steady voice of someone who has delivered this particular sentence many times. Joan asked 2 questions, how long, and would there be pain? The oncologist answered both honestly. Joan thanked him, shook his hand, and in the parking lot she turned to me and said, "Well, we better get the paperwork in order." That was Joan. She cried later at home in the kitchen with her hands braced on the counter and her shoulders shaking. I held her for a long time, but the first thing she said in the parking lot was about the paperwork. She spent the following months doing exactly that. She updated her will. She spoke with Gerald, our lawyer, at length. She organized the filing cabinet in the office, labeled everything, wrote a small notebook of instructions for things like where the house insurance documents were kept and when the septic needed to be serviced. She was thorough in the way she'd always been thorough, and I followed along behind her trying to hold myself together. Kevin and Cheryl came to visit twice during the illness. The first visit was good. Kevin sat with his mother for hours, and I could hear them talking and sometimes laughing, and it was enough. The second visit, in October, Cheryl spent 45 minutes in Joan's home office. Joan didn't mention it. I noticed, and I didn't mention it either. Joan passed on the 14th of November. Peacefully at home, in the bedroom with the curtain she'd picked out herself and the morning light coming through the east window, the way she always liked. She was 61 years old. She deserved another 30. Gerald arrived at 10 o'clock exactly. He was a small man with a precise gray beard and the quiet authority of someone who had spent 40 years making certain that the right thing happened in rooms where the wrong thing was being proposed. He shook my hand, set his briefcase on the table, and looked at Cheryl's papers without touching them. "I see you've come prepared," he said pleasantly. "We wanted to be organized," Cheryl said. "Of course." Gerald opened his own folder. "Shall we go through the actual document then?" Joan's will was straightforward. The house and its contents remained mine for the duration of my life, at which point it would pass to Kevin. The RRSPs, which had named me as beneficiary, transferred to me directly outside of the estate, as Gerald explained with the clarity of someone who knew this particular point would be contested. The investment account was split, 60% to me, 40% to Kevin, to be transferred within 90 days. Cheryl was writing notes. Fast, neat notes in her folder. "And the business?" she asked. The business, Gerald said, was never part of Jones' estate. Mr. Sherrill said, was never part of Jones' estate. Holloway, as sole proprietor, retains full ownership. But the business was built during the marriage, Sherrill said, under the Family Law Act. The Family Law Act governs the division of family property between spouses, Gerald said, with a patience that I suspected cost him some effort. Joan was a spouse. Kevin is a child. These are different categories, Sherrill, with different legal implications. Kevin set his coffee cup down. So what exactly does that mean for us? It means, I said, that the business is mine. The house is mine until I die. The RRSPs are mine outright. Kevin receives 40% of the investment account, which is approximately $68,000. Cheryl's pen stopped moving. That's not, she started. That's the will, Gerald said. The room was very quiet. The refrigerator hummed from the kitchen. Outside, a car passed slowly on the road. We'll need to contest it, Sherrill said. Sherrill said, not to Gerald, to Kevin. Kevin looked at the table. Kevin. My voice came out steadier than I felt. Look at me. He looked up. He had Joan's eyes, exactly her eyes, and for a second it cost me more than I can explain. If there's something you want to say, I said, say it. He was quiet for a long moment. Then quietly, we've been counting on more than this, Dad. I know you have, I said. That's been clear for some time. Sherrill leaned forward. What's that supposed to mean? It means, I said, that I've watched my wife spend the last 8 months dying, and during that time I watched the two of you visit twice and spend considerable energy assessing what you were going to receive when she was gone. It means that the Monday after Joan's funeral, you were on the phone with a solicitor. I looked at her steadily. I know because the solicitor called this number by mistake. Gerald's number is 1 digit different from ours. Kevin went pale. Sherrill's expression did something complicated. I also know, I continued, that during your visit in October, you spent time in Joan's home office. I believe you were looking for documents. The estate binder, perhaps. Or the business records. I paused. You didn't find the business records because they're kept at Gerald's office, not at ours. But I appreciate the effort. The silence that followed had a different quality than the one before. This one had weight. I want to be clear about something, I said. I'm 63 years old. I'm in reasonable health. I have no intention of dying conveniently to speed up anyone's financial planning. The business will continue to operate as it has. The house is my home and will remain so. Kevin's share of the investment account will be transferred as the will specifies. I looked at my son. That's it. You can't just, Sherrill began. Sherrill. Gerald's voice was quiet and final. I'd encourage you to speak with your own solicitor before making any legal claims. I'll tell you plainly that a challenge to this will is unlikely to succeed, and the legal costs of attempting it will likely exceed any sum you might recover. She sat back. Kevin stared at the table. I looked at my son. This boy I had coached and driven and worried over and loved for 32 years, and I felt something I didn't expect to feel. Not anger. Sadness. A long, tired sadness for what we had become and what I suspected we had been heading toward for longer than I wanted to admit. They left an hour later. Sherrill walked out first, without saying goodbye. Kevin paused at the door. I didn't know she called a solicitor that soon, he said. I believe you, I said. And I did, partly. She gets focused on things. I know she does. He stood there, not quite meeting my eyes. What happens now? That depends on you, I said. Not on her, on you. He nodded slowly, as if considering this for the first time. As if the idea that he had choices independent of his wife was a thought he hadn't entertained in years. Maybe he hadn't. I didn't know anymore how much of my son was still in there, underneath all the years of Cheryl's focus. I'd like to have dinner, I said. Next week, if you're free. Just you. Something shifted in his face. Something young. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I'd like that." He left. Gerald gathered his papers. Phil, who had barely said a word through the whole proceeding, clapped me once on the shoulder before he went. I stood alone in the dining room for a while after they'd all gone. The papers Cheryl had brought were still on the table. I stacked them neatly and set them on the side credenza. Joan's table looked fine without them. It always had. There are things I did not say in that meeting that I want to say now. To anyone who finds themselves in a room like that one, your children are not your heirs in the way that word gets used in old stories, as though the parent is simply a temporary guardian of wealth that was always meant to flow downward. Joan and I built what we built. We chose what to do with it. A parent who survives their spouse is not an obstacle to be managed or a complication in someone else's financial plan. We are people. We still are. Kevin called on Thursday. We had dinner on Saturday. Fa at a place in the Pandosi district that Joan and I used to go to after farmers market. He talked. I listened. He told me things about the last few years that I had suspected but hadn't known. The weight Cheryl put on money and position, on keeping up with people they knew. The arguments they had about things he felt he'd compromised on. He didn't blame her entirely. I didn't encourage him to. A marriage is two people, and Kevin had his own accounting to do. But he was there. That was what mattered. Sitting across from me, talking the way we used to when he was young, and I was the person he came to with things he couldn't figure out. I'd missed that. I hadn't realized how much until it came back. The business is doing well. I brought in a property manager named Douglas, a solid, no-nonsense man from Penticton who knows the Okanagan market better than almost anyone. I'm at the office 3 days a week. Less for financial reasons than because it gives me a reason to get dressed and somewhere to be. Joan would approve of that, I think. She was always practical about grief. Feel it, she would say. But don't let it be your only occupation. The house still has her things in it. I haven't rushed to change that. The stained walnut table is still in the dining room. The lilac bushes are still in the backyard, and in the spring, when they bloom, I plan to sit on the back porch with a coffee and look at them for as long as I want. No one gets to tell me how long that is. Not anymore. Cheryl and Kevin are still married. I don't know what the future of that looks like, and it is not mine to decide. What I know is that my son came to dinner, and the following week he came again, and the week after that he helped me clean out the garage. The two of us working in the good, honest quiet of men who are trying to find their way back to something. We didn't talk much, but he stayed until it was done. Joan would have liked that. She always said that men show love by showing up and staying. She was right about most things. I still talk to her sometimes in the morning before the house wakes up. I tell her about the weather, about the business, about Kevin. I tell her I'm managing. I tell her the table still looks beautiful. I don't know if she hears it, but I think she would want me to say it anyway. And so I do. I've had a lot of time to think about that morning since it happened. The way Cheryl walked up the driveway with her folder, the way Kevin stood at the window and said nothing, the way Gerald sat quietly and let the will speak for itself, because that's all it needed to do. People ask me sometimes, not often, but sometimes, whether I was angry. And the honest answer is that I was, for a while, but anger wasn't the thing that stayed. What stayed was something quieter and harder to name, a kind of grief that wasn't just about losing Joan, but about realizing that certain things had been coming for a long time and I'd simply chosen not to look directly at them. That's the part nobody tells you. The damage doesn't arrive all at once. It accumulates in small moments, a comment here, a silence there, the way someone looks at your home when they think you're not watching, and you let it accumulate because you love your son, and because you want to believe that people are fundamentally decent, and because it's easier to look away than to name what you're seeing. I let it go on longer than I should have. That's on me. What I know now, sitting on this side of it, is that Cheryl didn't lose anything she was ever entitled to. She lost what she had decided was hers before it was offered. There's a difference. What you earn, what you build, what someone freely gives you, those things have weight and meaning. What you take, or plan to take, or pressure someone into giving. That's a different kind of thing entirely. It hollows out. It doesn't sustain you the way you think it will. Kevin is learning that, I think. Slowly, in the way that people learn things. They probably should have understood earlier, but that's the nature of it. Some lessons only land when the weight of them becomes impossible to ignore. I'm not going to pretend I figured everything out young either. I've made my own accounting errors over the years, my own silences when I should have spoken. Wisdom isn't something you arrive at. It's something you keep working toward, and the work doesn't stop just because you get older. What I do know is this: the people who treated Joan's death as a starting gun for something. They didn't get what they came for, and they won't. Not because I'm punishing anyone, but because that's simply how it works when you build your plans on top of someone else's grief. The foundation doesn't hold. Joan built real things: a table, a garden, a business, a marriage, a life that had weight and texture and meaning. I intend to keep building in whatever time I have left. Not to prove anything, just because that's what she would have done, and because it's the only kind of life that actually feels like living. Kevin came for dinner again last week. We talked for 3 hours. The lilacs are already showing their first buds. I'll take it.